sat across the polished table as the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "We will begin today." Daniel shifted beside his wife and whispered, "Relax, this will be quick." I said, "I am relaxed," even though my hands were shaking under the table. The lawyer opened the folder and said, "This is the last will of your father." I nodded and said, "He wanted things simple." The lawyer read names, dates, and long sentences that felt sharp against my ears. When assets are divided, he said, the primary residence, business accounts, and investments go to Daniel. I laughed once and said, "That's not right." Daniel didn't look at me. Melissa smiled and said, "Please don't interrupt the process." I said my father promised me the house. The lawyer replied, "According to this document, that is not the case." I said, "Then the document is wrong." Daniel sighed and said, "You're being emotional." I asked, "Behind my back?" The lawyer continued, "You will receive a monthly stipend and personal effects." Melissa said, "His watch, letters, and old things." I said, "Those are memories, not inheritance." Daniel finally met my eyes and said, "It's fair." I felt my chest tighten and said, "You call this fair?" He replied, "You never wanted responsibility." I said, "I wanted honesty." The lawyer slid papers toward me and said, "Sign here to acknowledge receipt." I said, "I won't sign anything." Daniel said, "Don't make this ugly." I whispered, "You already did." Melissa leaned closer and said, "Think about your future." I said, "I am thinking very clearly." Every sentence felt like my father was being taken from me again. I said he would never leave me with nothing. He stood up and said, "We're done here." I stood too and said, "This isn't over." Daniel paused and said, "It is if you let it be." The lawyer avoided my eyes and said nothing. I gathered my bag and said, "You planned this." Daniel stayed silent, and that silence told me everything. I walked out knowing this was not a mistake, but a betrayal signed in ink. Daniel said, "I took responsibility." I said, "You took advantage." The lawyer finally spoke and said, "This meeting is concluded." I nodded and said, "Then my fight begins now." I stepped into the hallway and whispered, "You taught me better, Dad." My voice shook, but my resolve did not. I knew in that moment that I would uncover every lie, challenge every paper, and reclaim what was always mine. That understanding settled inside me quietly, heavy and clear, marking the exact second my sisterhood died forever and something harder was born instead. I waited until the house went quiet before I confronted Daniel. I wanted an explanation, maybe even an apology, because some small part of me still believed my brother would choose honesty over greed. He looked annoyed, as if I were interrupting something trivial. His calm dismissal hurt more than anger. I listened, stunned, as he reduced my care for our father into something useless and emotional. I tried to remind him of our father's promises, of late nights and whispered assurances, but Daniel spoke over me. He said responsibility mattered more than memories. Each sentence pushed me further away from the brother I thought I knew. I realized he wasn't confused or conflicted. He was certain. Our mother, Margaret, stood nearby, folding her hands as if silence could protect her. I waited for her to defend me, to question him, to do anything. She didn't. She chose calm over truth, peace over fairness. Her quiet presence felt heavier than Daniel's lies. In that moment, I understood how betrayal could exist without shouting or violence. He framed his actions as survival, as growth, as maturity. I saw them for what they were. He had learned how to take without asking. When I accused him of changing after our father became sick, he didn't deny it. That was when something inside me finally cracked. I looked at my mother and realized her silence was a choice. She wasn't unaware, she was afraid. Afraid of conflict, of losing her son, of facing the truth. I felt abandoned in a house I once called home. The walls that held my childhood now felt cold and unfamiliar. Daniel didn't owe me honesty, and my mother wouldn't demand it. Blood, I learned, didn't guarantee loyalty. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door without waiting for permission. No one stopped me. No one followed. I left knowing I no longer belonged to the family I defended, and that realization changed me forever. I'd been loyal to people who measured love in control and comfort. My grief had made me patient, but patience had cost me my place. I promised myself I would stop shrinking to keep others calm. It clarified everything. This moment marked the end of my innocence and the beginning of a resolve I would not abandon again, no matter how painful the road ahead became eventually. I stood in front of the house I grew up in and knew something was wrong before I touched the door. The key my father gave me no longer fit. I tried again, slower, like patience might change metal. It didn't. When the door finally opened from the inside, Melissa looked at me with a polite smile that felt rehearsed. She said the locks were changed for security reasons, as if my presence had suddenly become a threat. The hallway felt unfamiliar, like the walls had shifted when I wasn't looking. I went straight to my room, or what used to be my room. The door was open, the bed was gone. The shelves were empty. Even the curtains were missing. It looked like a guest room prepared for someone who would never stay. I stood there, frozen, trying to understand how a life could be packed away so neatly. Melissa followed me and spoke softly, telling me not to take it personally. She said space was needed and adjustments had to be made. Her voice stayed calm, almost kind, but her words pushed me further toward the door. When I asked where my things were, she said they were stored somewhere safe. She didn't say where. She didn't offer to show me. Daniel came in after her and avoided looking at the room. He said this arrangement was temporary, but things were complicated right now. His tone was flat, final, like a decision already settled. I asked him how long temporary lasted. He didn't answer. He told me to be reasonable, to understand the pressure he was under. I wondered when pressure had become an excuse to erase someone. I walked into the living room and saw boxes stacked near the wall. My name was written on one in faded ink. I was being removed. As I reached for the box, a familiar voice spoke behind me. Thomas, who had worked for my father longer than I had been alive, met my eyes quietly. He didn't say much. He never did. He asked if I was all right, and when I nodded, he leaned closer. In a low voice, he mentioned that papers had been changed near the end, that signatures appeared where they hadn't before. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't need to. The way he spoke told me he was afraid of being heard. I asked him why he was telling me this. He said my father trusted me. That was all. Then he walked away like he had said too much. I packed what little remained into a single suitcase. Clothes, photos, a book my father loved. No one helped me. No one stopped me. When I stood at the door again, Daniel told me to call before coming next time. Melissa wished me well. Their words followed me out, hollow and light. I stepped outside carrying everything I had left. The house behind me no longer felt like home. It felt like evidence. As I walked away, shame burned my chest, but beneath it something stronger began to form. I didn't know exactly what had been taken from me yet, but I knew one thing clearly. I was done pretending this was an accident. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and said out loud, "You shouldn't have left me like this." The room answered with silence, and that silence finally broke me. I pressed my face into my hands and whispered, "I held everything together for you." I cried without holding back, because no one was there to see me fall apart. I said, "I did everything you asked," and my voice cracked. I remembered my father saying, "You're stronger than you think." I laughed bitterly and said, "You were wrong." I wiped my face and said, "Or maybe I didn't want to be strong." I replayed his voice in my head, calm and steady, explaining numbers at the kitchen table. He had said, "Always keep copies." I whispered, "I did." That realization made my breath stop. I stood up and said, "I still have them." The sadness didn't disappear, but it shifted. I said, "You trusted me for a reason." I pulled my bag closer and talked to myself, think clearly. My phone rang and Emily's name filled the screen. I answered and said, "I can't do this anymore." She said, "Tell me what happened." I said, "They erased me." She said, "Slow down." I said, "They took the house, the papers, everything." She said, "What about you?" I said, "I'm empty." She said, "It's not." I told her, "I keep hearing his voice." She said, "That means he's still with you." I said, "Then why does this hurt so much?" She said, "Because you loved him." I said, "And they used that." She paused and said, "What do you want now?" I said, "I want it to stop." She asked, "Do you want peace or justice?" I didn't answer right away. I said, "I don't know." She said, "You're allowed to want fairness." I said, "They'll say I'm greedy." She said, "Let them." I said, "My mother won't stand with me." She said, "Then stand for yourself." I said, "What if I lose?" She said, "What if you don't try?" I closed my eyes and said, "He showed me the accounts." She said, "Say that again." I said, "He trusted me with documents." She said, "Do you still have them?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you're not powerless." I felt something tighten and then settle inside me. I said, "I'm done crying." She said, "Good." I said, "I'm done begging." She said, "Better." I looked around the room and said, "I need space to think." She said, "I'm here." I said, "I know." I ended the call and sat quietly. The grief was still there, heavy and real. But beneath it, anger finally had direction. I opened my bag and said, "Let's begin." I spread the files across the small table and said, "You told me to keep copies." My voice sounded strange in the quiet room. I opened one folder and whispered, "You knew something would happen." The dates stared back at me, wrong and unfamiliar. I flipped another page and said, "Neither does this." My hand shook as I traced a signature and said, "That isn't his handwriting." I sat back and said, "Daniel changed it." I picked up my phone and said, "I need a lawyer." Mr. Harris answered after the third ring and said, "This is Harris." I said, "You don't know me, but I need help." He said, "Slow down." I said, "My father's will was altered." He paused and said, "That's serious." I said, "I have copies." He said, "Bring them." We met the next day and I slid the papers across his desk. He adjusted his glasses and said, "Where did these come from?" I said, "My father gave them to me." He said, "Before he passed?" I said, "Yes." He studied the pages and said, "These dates don't align." I asked, "So I'm not imagining it?" He said, "No." I said, "My brother said I was emotional." He said, "Facts aren't emotional." He pointed to a line and said, "This signature was added later." I felt my throat tighten and said, "He forged it." Mr. Harris said, "It appears that way." I asked, "Can it be proven?" He said, "Yes, but it won't be easy." I said, "I don't care." He leaned back and said, "You should." I asked, "Why?" He said, "This could damage your family permanently." I said, "They already damaged me." He said, "People will talk." I said, "They already are." He said, "Your mother may suffer." I said, "She chose silence." He said, "Your brother will fight back." I said, "He already did." Mr. Harris folded his hands and said, "Are you ready for that?" He said, He said, "Once we file, there's no turning back." I said, "I'm not looking back." He said, "You could settle privately." I said, "He wouldn't tell the truth." He said, "You could lose relationships." I said, "I already lost them." He nodded slowly and said, "Then this becomes about justice." I said, "It always was." He said, "I need your permission to proceed." I said, "You have it." He said, "I'll draft the challenge." I said, "Thank you." He said, "For what?" I said, "For believing me." He paused and said, "The documents did that." I gathered the files and said, "My father trusted the right person." Mr. Harris said, "Make sure you trust yourself too." I stepped outside and said, "I choose truth." The fear didn't leave me, but it stopped controlling me. I walked forward knowing peace built on lies was never peace at all. I walked into the lawyer's office and said, "I'm challenging the will." Daniel slammed his hand on the desk and said, "You can't do that." I said, "I already did." He leaned forward and said, "You'll regret this." I replied, "I already regret trusting you." The lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Let's stay professional." Daniel snapped, "She's lying." I said, "Then prove I am." He stared at me and said, "You want to ruin our family." I said, "You already ruined it." He said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "I'm fixing one." Margaret rushed in and said, "Please stop this." I looked at her and said, "Not this time." She said, "People will talk." I said, "They always do." She said, "Your father wouldn't want this." I said, "My father wanted truth." Daniel laughed and said, "You think you can win?" I said, "I think you're afraid." He stood up and said, "I won't let you destroy me." I said, "I'm not destroying anything." He said, "I'll fight you." I said, "I expect that." The lawyer said, "The challenge is filed." Daniel glared and said, "You'll be alone." I said, "I already was." Margaret grabbed my arm and whispered, "Please think." I pulled away and said, "I am thinking." She said, This will shame us. I said, lies shame us. Daniel walked out and slammed the door. The silence felt different this time. I exhaled and said, I'm done being scared. Later that day, Lavra called and said, we need to talk. I said, why now? She said, because guilt doesn't sleep. We met quietly and she said, Daniel asked me to witness changes. I asked, to the will? She nodded and said, I didn't know the full truth then. I said, you know it now. She said, yes, I said. Will you tell the court? She hesitated and said, I'm scared. I said, so was I. She said, he'll hate me. I said, he already chose himself. I left the meeting and felt something shift inside me. Fear still existed, but it no longer ruled me. I called Margaret and said, I'm moving forward. She cried and said, I don't recognize you. I said, I finally recognize myself. I sat alone afterward and said to myself, this is what standing feels like. My phone buzzed and Daniel texted, you'll pay for this. I typed back, I already paid. He replied, you think you're strong now? I answered, I know I am. He sent, you need me. I wrote, I needed honesty. The typing stopped and the silence felt earned. I whispered, whatever comes next, I will face it, and meant every word as I stepped forward without looking back again. My fear stayed behind me, replaced by resolve, clarity, and a sense of self. I walked into the courthouse and whispered to myself, this is it. Daniel didn't look at me. Melissa gave a small, tight-lipped smile and said, you really think you can win? I said, I'm not thinking, I'm proving. She frowned and muttered, this isn't necessary. I whispered, neither was your theft. The judge called the session to order and I listened as the papers were presented. Daniel's lawyer argued quickly, but the evidence I'd collected held firm. I leaned closer to Mr. Harris and said, check that signature again. He nodded and whispered, it's as we suspected. Melissa's confidence began to falter. She looked at Daniel and asked, are you sure about this? He said, it's fine. But his voice lacked conviction. I noticed his business partners exchanging looks in the gallery. One whispered, I don't like this. Another muttered, better be careful. I said quietly, they're leaving you. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me but didn't meet mine. Melissa said, ignore them. Just focus, I said. Focus on what? The truth is already here. The judge called for a recess. I heard snatches of conversation outside the courtroom. Daniel's lawyer said, we need a new strategy. Melissa whispered, maybe we underestimated her. I smiled slightly, though my chest ached. I whispered to myself, karma doesn't rush, but it arrives. I said quietly, it's too late for confidence now. Melissa's gaze kept flicking to me, lips pressed thin. I whispered, even she sees it. Daniel leaned back and whispered to Melissa, she's ruined us. She said softly, don't say that yet. I listened, heart tight, and whispered, it's happening. Mr. Harris presented each document methodically. I whispered, this is what happens when you lie. Daniel's shoulders slumped. Melissa's smile vanished completely. I didn't feel triumph. I watched them flounder, their plans unraveling in front of everyone. I whispered, they're leaving you, Daniel. Daniel looked around, helpless. I whispered, no one's coming back. Melissa tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. I breathed slowly and whispered, it's working. The tension didn't leave my chest. I whispered, I didn't ask for this, but it's right. I looked at Daniel and whispered, you'll understand too late. The hearing adjourned and I walked out quietly. I felt both strong and heartbroken, knowing justice didn't heal everything, but it had arrived. The knock on my door was soft, hesitant. I opened it and said, what are you doing here? Daniel's face was pale, his eyes red. He stepped inside, shivering, and said, please, just listen. I said, fine, but don't waste my time. He looked down and said, I was wrong. I crossed my arms and said, you were wrong every day you erased me. He said, I was scared. I thought I had no choice. I asked, fear of what? He said, failing, losing everything. Dad. I said, Dad trusted me too. He said, I panicked. I said, panic doesn't justify betrayal. He swallowed hard and said, I didn't know how to stop. I whispered, "You stopped loving me a long time ago." He shook his head and said, I still care. I said, care? You stole my life, he said. I thought I was protecting the family. I said, by taking everything from me? He looked at the floor and said, I didn't know better. I asked, did you think of me at all? He said, because I was weak. I laughed bitterly and said, weak? You call that weak? He said, yes, I was afraid to disappoint Dad, to lose respect. I said, you lost my respect anyway. He said, I know, and I hate myself for it. I whispered, do you know what it's like to cry alone at night, remembering his words and trusting you? He shook his head and said, I can't imagine, I'm sorry. I said, sorry doesn't fix sleepless nights. He said, I'll do anything. Anything to make it right. I said, it's too late for anything. He said, please, I'll do whatever you want. I said, I don't want anything from you. He asked, not even forgiveness? I paused and said, I won't lie. Part of me wants to say yes. He said, I deserve that chance. I said, maybe, but not now. He said, I can't believe I hurt you so much. I whispered, I believed you once. That belief nearly destroyed me. He said, I know, and I'll live with that forever. I said, I need time. I need space. He said, take all you want. I'll wait. I asked, for how long? He said, as long as it takes. I said, I won't promise you anything. He nodded, tears streaming, and said, I understand. I'll take what I can get. I looked at him and said, I hope someday you understand what trust really means. He said, I do now. I closed the door gently behind him. I leaned against it and whispered, I can't fix this. I can't go back. The night was quiet and I let the silence hold me. I walked to my bed, heart aching, knowing I had survived the storm he caused, and that my future no longer belonged to anyone but me. The judge called the session to order and said, we are ready to hear the verdict. I said quietly, let's get this over with. Daniel's lawyer whispered something to him. He said, you'll regret this. I replied softly, I already lived regret, Daniel. The judge reviewed the documents and said, after examining the evidence and testimony, the judge continued, the original shares shall be restored to the rightful heirs. I whispered, finally. Daniel's face went pale. Melissa's hand covered her mouth. I said quietly, it's done. The lawyer glanced at me and said, you did everything correctly. I said, it is real. You made it real for me. Melissa said, I can't stay here. I whispered, go. She left quickly, slamming the door behind her. Daniel stared at the floor, empty, lost. I said softly, it's over. Not even for yourself? He looked up briefly and said, I tried. I said, tried? Tried and failed. The judge said, court adjourned. I stood slowly, gathering my bag, my papers, my dignity. Daniel didn't move. I whispered, you taught me too much about trust and loss. He said, I don't know what to say. I said, then don't. Just listen to what's left. The lawyers exchanged glances, whispering congratulations. I said quietly, I didn't come for applause. He lowered his gaze. I felt no triumph, no joy, only calm. I said, I get what's mine. That's enough. He whispered, can it be undone? I said, nothing can undo what you broke, but the law can fix what you stole. He said, I'm sorry. I said quietly, I heard it before. Words can't change reality. I walked past him toward the exit. The sunlight outside felt different, not warm, but clear. I whispered, I have my father's legacy back. I have my life back. Daniel stayed behind, empty-handed and hollow. I said softly, winning doesn't heal everything, but it restores balance. I stepped outside, holding the papers, my dignity, and a quiet strength that no one could take. The door closed behind me, and I knew my future belonged only to me. I watched from my apartment window as Daniel's car pulled away from yet another office. The sign above read closed, and I didn't feel triumph. I whispered, so this is what happens when lies build a life. I heard his phone ringing constantly, but no one answered anymore. Friends who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his calls. I remembered the dinners where I had sat quietly, invisible, while he charmed the room. Now, silence followed him like a shadow. Margaret called me one evening. Her voice trembled as she said, I I should have stood up for you. I sat on the edge of my bed and replied, I needed you then. She sniffled. I was afraid. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I understand, I whispered, but understanding doesn't erase the nights I cried alone. There was a long pause. She said, Can you forgive me? I exhaled slowly and said, I accept your apology, but I don't forget. I spent the next days arranging my life carefully. I reviewed my father's documents, checked accounts, and reminded myself that the future I was building was mine alone. I whispered to myself, This is your chance. Build it right. I walked past Daniel's old offices, noticing the for sale signs and empty chairs. I imagined the panic in his eyes as he realized no one would bail him out. I didn't gloat. I simply observed. Karma didn't need me to push it unfolded naturally, a quiet reckoning for choices he had made. One evening, I met with Thomas. He smiled faintly and said, I knew you'd get here. I said, It wasn't easy, but I survived. He nodded and said, Your father would be proud. I touched the papers I had carried from the courtroom and whispered, I hope so. I did it for him, not for anyone else. I began reconnecting with Emily, sharing meals, planning small trips, laughing over things I had forgotten I enjoyed. I whispered, Life can still feel light after darkness. She asked about my work, my plans, and I told her truthfully. I said, I'm finally making decisions for myself. That's enough. I looked at my reflection in the window, night sky behind me, and whispered, I'm not the girl who cried alone anymore. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to Daniel's fall. I felt calm, anchored, and quietly victorious. I wasn't celebrating his ruin. I was celebrating myself. And for the first time in years, I smiled without hesitation, knowing the future was mine to shape. I stood before Dad's grave, the autumn wind tugging at my coat. I whispered, I'm here, Dad. I need to say it out loud. I knelt and said, I'm sorry I doubted myself. I'm sorry I ever thought I wasn't enough. A bird passed overhead, wings slicing the gray sky. I said, I held on to anger for too long and it didn't help me. I held on to guilt and it almost crushed me. I pressed my hand to the cold stone and said, I forgive myself for believing everyone around me would protect me, even when they didn't. I laughed softly, a bitter, warm sound. And I forgive you for not being here to stop them, Dad. I understand now. The sun dipped behind the trees and shadows stretched across the ground. I whispered, I'm letting go of it all. The hurt, the fear, the nights I thought I'd never recover. I thought of Daniel. I remembered the lies, the betrayals, and the hollow apologies. I whispered, I don't need to forgive him. I don't need to talk to him. I just need to live. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was Daniel. The message read, I need your help, please. I stared at it, fingers hovering, and whispered, I remember what you did. I remember everything. I put the phone back in my pocket and said, But I don't owe you anything. Not now, not ever. I stood straight, taking a deep breath. The wind felt lighter somehow. I whispered, Closure isn't forgiveness. Closure is peace. Closure is finally choosing myself. I touched the gravestone one last time and said, I'll carry your lessons with me, Dad. Your trust in me wasn't wasted. I'm stronger because of it. I looked around the quiet cemetery and noticed the fallen leaves, the gentle sway of the trees. I whispered, I'm ready to keep living without looking back, without reopening old wounds. I walked away slowly, shoes crunching over gravel, feeling a calm I hadn't known in years. The message from Daniel stayed on my screen. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I whispered softly to the empty air, I've chosen peace. That's enough. For the first time in a long while, I felt free. The grief was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I carried strength instead, quiet and unwavering. I smiled faintly, stepping into the path ahead, knowing that living fully was the only revenge I needed against the past. I stood in the study, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and whispered to myself, This is mine, all of it. The papers, the accounts, the keys, everything that had been taken from me were back where they belonged. I ran my fingers over the edge of my father's desk and said softly, I didn't have to fight him. He fought himself. Emily leaned against the doorway and said, You look different. I smiled faintly and said, I feel different. She asked, Stronger? I nodded. Not just stronger. Clear. I see everything now. I picked up a folder with my father's handwriting and whispered, He trusted me. I didn't betray that. I thought of Daniel, empty and defeated, wandering through a life he built on lies. I said softly, I didn't destroy him. I remembered the nights I cried alone, the nights I feared the world, the nights I thought I was powerless. I said, I'm not invisible anymore, I never was. I just needed to claim it. Margaret called from the kitchen. I see it now, the woman you've become. I smiled quietly and said, I'm not doing this to show anyone. I'm doing it for me, for Dad. Thomas stopped by with the mail. He said, everything is back in order. I said, thank you for keeping the truth safe. He nodded and said softly, you earned this. I walked past the windows and looked out at the city. I whispered, everything I lost was never truly gone. I just didn't know how to take it back. Emily asked, do you ever think about forgiving him? I shook my head slowly. Forgiveness isn't necessary. Understanding is enough. I understand now. I paused, looking at my reflection in the glass. I'm not the scared girl who let others decide her life. I'm the woman who finally did. I opened my father's old journal and read aloud softly, strength isn't about power over others. It's about control over yourself. I closed it and whispered, I finally understand that. I heard the faint chime of my phone. A message from Daniel appeared. I'm sorry, can we talk? I stared at it and whispered, I don't need him anymore. I didn't reply. I wouldn't, not because I hate him, but because I choose myself now. I walked to my father's portrait, eyes bright, and whispered, I didn't just reclaim what was taken. I reclaimed who I am. Emily said softly, you're radiant. I laughed quietly and said, radiant, yes. But more than that, I'm free. The city hummed outside, indifferent, but I felt anchored, grounded, complete. I whispered, justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply returning what was always yours. I moved through the house, touching familiar furniture, breathing deeply, feeling the calm and satisfaction that comes from knowing I fought for myself and won without losing who I was. I whispered again, I am enough. I always was. And now the world can see it too. I stepped onto the balcony, wind brushing my face, and said softly, I'm ready for whatever comes next, strong, unshaken, whole. For the first time in years, I smiled fully, quietly victorious, knowing that everything I had ever deserved had always been mine.